Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Got a story about a trucker, and a lot of people have asked me about it. I have a disproportionate number of truckers in my audience. A lot of people in my audience drive trucks. And they say that, when you're driving long distances like that, you need something to entertain yourself, and you can only listen to so much radio or the CB. And so a lot of them tell me they download my videos and listen to them while they drive. And I've mentioned before, I have an immense amount of respect for truck drivers because everything in America moves by truck at one time or another. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. But if you go to your local supermarket in Novi, Michigan, and buy a head of lettuce, it was probably put into a truck in California and trucked someplace and processed and moved by truck someplace else. And it may have been driven cross country in a truck or possibly by train, but then at the other end, it gets put back on a truck and winds up being trucked to the store. So everything sooner or later is moved by truck. Even cars are moved by truck. If you see the big car haulers going down the road. So you have to really respect truck drivers, and they're a vital part of our economy and just our life. So this story is a tragic story on several levels. And it's got a lot of people upset, but I've actually heard truck drivers come down on both sides on this one. So this story I'm going to tell you is widely reported. CNN had it. Los Angeles 7 ABC is what I'm going to read to you from. I saw it reported pretty much in every outlet. Truck driver sentenced to 110 years in prison in deadly 28-car pileup in Colorado. So he was involved in a pileup in a truck he was driving, and he's been sentenced to 110 years in prison as a result. But here's the deal. The story took place on I-70 in Denver. 4 people were killed in the accident, and the man was put on trial, and he's been sentenced now to 110 years in prison after being found guilty. He's 26 years old. He was driving a semi-tractor trailer in April of 2019, and he was traveling at 85 miles per hour. Now, some of these facts could be disputed, but they had a trial. And the evidence that we're talking about here is pretty much what came out at trial. So the allegation is he was traveling at 85 miles per hour when his brakes failed. And that's what he apparently told investigators at the time. My brakes failed. He tried to pull over the shoulder to avoid stopped traffic, but another semi had already stopped there, and so there's no place for him to go. The crash led to a 28-car pileup. It left 4 people dead, and he was found guilty in October and convicted on vehicular homicide and 23 other charges. That's all according to the district attorney's office in Colorado's 1st Judicial District. The other 23 charges include 6 counts of assault in the first degree, extreme indifference, 10 counts of attempts to commit assault in the first degree, extreme indifference, 2 counts of vehicular assault, reckless, 1 count of reckless driving, and 4 counts of careless driving causing death. Now, every state has laws like this, but they're titled differently and the standards are different from state to state. But generally speaking, we all know what murder is. If you watch Perry Mason, you know what murder is. I'm dating myself, I know. And so that's what you typically think of as a homicide case. But if you do something reckless that results in the death of someone else, there are all kinds of different homicides or manslaughters or things like that they can charge you with. And one of the most common ones you hear of is where somebody is driving a vehicle in a dangerous fashion. If you're driving a vehicle dangerously and negligently and it results in the death of someone else, then there often are laws about that will parallel homicide. He was sentenced to the minimum available on all counts, but they're being served consecutively, which totals 110 years. During a sentencing hearing on Monday, the judge said he was bound by the state law and he had to do it that way. So you may have heard that someone will get sentenced for 3 crimes where the sentence is 20 years per crime. So you can get sentenced 3 times for 20 years and you can serve those sentences concurrently. So that in essence, you're serving a 20-year term at the same time for all 3 crimes. Here, apparently the law says these must be stacked. They must be consecutive. So each one, you serve out the one, then you serve out the next. Then you serve out the next, you serve out the next. And you go down the line. And when you add it all up, it's 110 years. Judge said his hands were tied by a law passed by state lawmakers that required him to sentence the truck driver to consecutive sentences, meaning they are served back to back to back to back. He said, if I had the discretion, if I thought I had the discretion, I would not run those sentences consecutively. Now, there were 4 people who died in the crash, and prosecutors argued that the truck driver acted recklessly and made a series of poor decisions before the wreck happened. Among other things, they say he passed by a runaway truck ramp on the side of the highway, but chose not to use it. And that was reported by NBC affiliate KUSA of Denver. Colorado law requires courts to sentence most individuals convicted of certain categories of crimes to a mandatory minimum period of incarceration. That's according to the Colorado General Assembly website. There will be an appeal as to the facts and mistakes made in the trial, says the man's attorney. And his attorney says that the truck driver does not deserve to die in prison because, of course, 110 years in prison for a 26-year-old man would, in fact, be a death sentence. The issue with his appeal will not be the sentence itself. Under the law, the court was not incorrect. I'm only laughing because that's how attorneys talk. He could have said, under the law, the court was correct. But he said, under the law, the court was not incorrect. However, the law as written is barbaric and draconian, he said. There needs to be a change in the law. So he's going to appeal it, apparently, on one of the appeal grounds, that the law itself is unjust when applied in real life. And what often happens is laws get passed by legislators. Oftentimes they get passed after something happens. Tragedy. Everyone looks at this and goes, oh, that's a tragedy. How did that happen? That tragedy that happened. Let's pass a law so that if this ever happens again, we come down hard on the person who does it. And they often name those laws. Steve's Law. And it's, the terrible thing happened to Steve. Okay, next time it happens, we'll invoke Steve's Law. And the person will get hammered and go away for a long period of time. And somewhere along the line, the Colorado legislature said, well, if somebody commits these kind of crimes, we're going to stack the sentences instead of letting them run concurrently. And I saw a lot of commentary on Facebook and elsewhere by friends of mine, many of whom are truck drivers. And their point is that it looks like the guy screwed up very, very badly, especially if he's doing 85 miles per hour. I believe he was hauling lumber, which is very, very heavy. 85 miles per hour. Apparently passed a runaway truck ramp and didn't use it, although he could have, according to some of the testimony, and wound up in a 28-car pileup where 4 people died. And if you go on the internet, you can find footage of the accident. There's all kinds of footage of the accident, and it's horrific. It's utterly horrific. And I don't think anybody is arguing that the guy shouldn't be charged with something. And I don't think anybody's arguing that the guy shouldn't be convicted and serve some time in jail. But the question is whether 110 years in jail is appropriate. And I can think of other situations, a few that happened in Michigan. There was a presidential visit, about 15, 20 years ago now, I think, where there's a huge backup on I-75 near Flint, and traffic came to a halt because they'd shut the highway down to let the motorcade through. This is a few presidents back. And with all this backed up traffic, somebody not paying attention came around a curve and just plowed into the tail end of that backup and killed some people. I can think of another example where on US 23 near Heartland, Michigan, there's an exit ramp, and the exit ramp comes down a hill to M59. And a guy driving a work truck came down that exit ramp, hit his brakes, the pedal went straight to the floor. It wasn't a big truck like this, but it was a large enough truck to rear end somebody and killed a family. And in that case, investigators asked him, well, what's the deal? Did you hit your brakes? He goes, yeah, I tried, but the brakes failed. And they said, well, when did you first suspect you had problems with your brakes? He said, oh, before I got in the truck this morning. That truck's had problems with the brakes, but my boss tells me I got to keep driving it. So I keep driving it. And every day the brakes got worse and worse and worse. And today they failed. So, yeah, what are you going to do? And so the question always becomes, who's responsible for this? And how avoidable was it? And so we often hear of accidents that involve alcohol. And there's no allegation of alcohol in this case. I'm simply talking about examples in general. And when people drink alcohol and get in an accident, you can look at that and go, obviously you did that to yourself, and you are responsible for yourself and get behind the wheel, and everyone knows you don't drink and drive. That's so obvious. We have no question about liability in that one. But when a guy gets in a truck and says, well, the truck has had bad brakes for a while that I've known about, but my boss says I got to keep driving, so I keep driving. I remember talking to people who said, well, Steve, the guy didn't want to lose his job. His job's important. And for some odd reason, no one ever does the calculus and says, oh, my job is important, but if those brakes fail and I kill somebody, is that worth it? And you know what everyone's thinking. Everyone goes, well, that's not going to happen to me. I've driven a truck with sketchy brakes before. And I remember driving my Army truck. I had a deuce and a half M35A2. And at one point in time, I needed to have the brakes bled because the pedal got real spongy. And it had an e-brake on a lever. Actually, correct my, just the guys in the Army will know this. E-brakes in the left hand on M35. And I remember driving it home one day where I had to use the e-brake for every stop. And I remember the nightmare of understanding how big that vehicle was, how heavy that vehicle was, how that vehicle was not going to lose an argument with any vehicle on the road. And I had to be real careful and use that e-brake to stop it. And so someone who's driving with a truckload of timber, 85 miles per hour in Colorado, and winds up in a fiery 28-car pileup, if a jury finds them responsible for that, I have no problem with the reckless driving or the vehicular assault or the extreme indifference and so on, and careless driving causing death. Those are crimes that seem appropriate to be charged here. Those seem appropriate. The question I think most people have is the sentence, 110 years. So we'll see what happens. It's going to go up on appeal. And unfortunately for the litigants in this case, this is the kind of appeal that's going to take a really long time. Because what you have to appeal, if you're going to go on the theory that the law is draconian and cruel or whatever the guy said, you have to make that argument to say that the law is, in essence, unjust. But courts routinely say that legislators are given deference. If a majority of the legislature passed it and the governor signed it into law, it's presumed to be lawful. And so the only way you can get around that is if it violates the Colorado state constitution or it violates the U.S. Constitution. Is this cruel and unusual punishment? It might be. It might be. But to get that question answered would take a federal court and a federal court appeals process, which means they probably have to exhaust their state court remedies and make the arguments in state court first. So I wouldn't be surprised if this case didn't have a final resolution for 5 or 6 years, maybe longer. So we'll see. But if I'm still doing videos 6 years from now, someone mark a calendar, please. I will do an update on this when it finally comes down, and I'll try to follow it through the process because I'm sure we're going to learn a lot of interesting things along the way. But Jose, Chris, Jeff, Ezekiel, and Jimmy, thanks for sending it. Truck driver sentenced to 110 years in prison in deadly 28-car pileup in Colorado from Los Angeles 7, ABC. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. You won't find reasonable men at the top of tall mountains.